Welcome to Presents. I'm your host, Sky McGeehee. We are joined this week by Maria Pia Paganelli, who is the president of the International Adam Smith Society and a professor of economics at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. Please join me in welcoming Professor Paganelli. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here.
So you're here to present the Adam Smith Lecture series, the Adam Smith Lecture at Boise State. Obviously, you're the president of the International Adam Smith Society as well. So who is Adam Smith, and why is there an international society in his name in the first place?
So Adam Smith is a Scottish thinker. He lived in the 18th century. He lived most of his life in Scotland, actually. He was a professor at the University of Glasgow. He taught moral philosophy. And he wrote two books. One is called The Theory of Moral Sentiments, is his first book. And the second book that he wrote is The Wealth of Nations. He was quite famous during his time because of both books. First, because of Theory of Moral Sentiments, and then even more famous because of The Wealth of Nations. And then, I guess, his work became interested enough people, both in philosophy as well as in economics, first in economics and later in philosophy, as well as in English. And so now we have scholars that work on Adam Smith in several different disciplines in different countries throughout the world. And so we have an International Adam Smith Society so that we can bring together people from different disciplines in different parts of the world to exchange ideas about Smith's works.
That's important. So I read that Smith's writing style was often satirized, in his day. Was his transition from that to being actually taken serious in his lifetime, or was that sort of after his death?
I think he was always taken seriously in his days as well as after. Probably after there were more caricatures about what his thought was, mostly because, especially with the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, his views coming from the Wealth of Nations, so his economics view, were simplified probably too much, and probably not in a very genuine way, so that you have the caricature of self-interest that is linked to economics, so that self-interest is the only thing that matters, and greed is good.
Right.
So those are all caricatures that come out and are often associated with Smith, even though they're not part of Smith's core message.
They're not actually representative of him.
Right.
It's really interesting. So how did you personally become interested in Adam Smith?
When I was doing my graduate work, I was interested in the evolution of money, and I was interested in how we got to fiat money, which is the kind of money that we have in our pocket today. So the kind of banknotes that do not have an intrinsic value and that cannot be converted into other things. So the first examples of fiat money were in late 18th century, early 19th century. So I started to read everybody who wrote about money in that time, and Smith was one of them, and I sort of got hooked and haven't left him since.
So do you prefer The Wealth of Nations or his other book better?
Theory of Moral Sentiments?
Yes.
That's a very difficult question, and I think that today I would answer it as The Wealth of Nations. Had you asked me 4 years ago, I would have answered Theory of Moral Sentiments.
Right.
But I spent the last couple of years working a lot on The Wealth of Nations, and it grew back to me, and I started to appreciate it more and more.
So are there common confusions that people have about Smith's thought and work?
I think it's impossible not to, given that most thinkers who are not alive today and have written something substantial can be misinterpreted quite easily. And Smith himself has, like, his body of work is such that you can find everything in it, in a sense. So you can have any economic positions and you can find support in it, in The Wealth of Nations, and it depends on what you choose, you can actually take out that sentence that supports your argument, which implies that you have very contradicting argument coming out of the Wealth of Nations, as well as theory of moral sentiments, of course. So it's very easy to pick a sentence out of a 1,000-page,
right.
And say, well, you see, this is what he said. Yeah, exactly. So, which also means that it's very easy to have a lot of funny ideas.
Right.
Yeah.
So would you say a lot of people kind of misconstrue his words and kind of twist them to a new meaning that wasn't what he originally intended?
Right. I'm not sure about scholars. I think scholars
Right.
tend to be a little bit more careful, but Smith is one of those figures that has been used in popularized
Right.
versions. And so it's much easier, because of the popularization of his name, to have caricature-like.
Right.
And so often there is this association of greed is good with Smith, which they never said.
Right.
And I think it's something that is tapering off in the last few decades, because a lot of scholars have been working and trying to say, well, no, Smith never said that greed is
It's
good.
not true, yeah.
So I think is because of his popularity as is not quite a household name, but at least within a certain intellectual community is a name that has been heard. You have to have the bumper sticker version of it, and sometimes the bumper sticker is more of a joke than an actual serious thing.
Right, so his, would you say that his message has become kind of diluted over the years?
I think actually over the years being refined, because I think it was more common to think of Adam Smith equals invisible hand, equal free market, equal self-interest,
Right.
Probably in the 80s than it is today. I think today is that there's enough work being done and enough people trying to bring about the message that there is more to Smith than this Adam Smith tie that you would find in the Reagan years.
Right, this greed is good
Yeah.
thing. So Smith is sometimes called the father of modern economics. To what extent would you agree or disagree with that statement?
In a sense, it's very true. Mostly because I think his method is the same method that we use today. In the sense of we make some assumptions, and then we see what happens when we change some constraints. And Smith's method is basically the same. Like, he makes some assumption, it changes one variable,
Right.
and then he sees what the consequences are. So in that sense, is a scientist, like today's scientist. His method is experimental in a sense of he uses history as his laboratory, like many people in the Scottish Enlightenment would use history as a way to increase their data set. In other ways, the discipline has evolved significantly, and so I don't think Smith would ever be hired in an economics department today.
Right. So can you explain to me a little bit more what behavioral economics is?
So behavioral economics is a relatively new branch of economics that more explicitly uses experiments, an experimental method, not just theoretically like Smith did, but actually in practice. So what you do is you design an experiment. You take a group of subjects, usually are undergraduate students, just because they're available and they're not too expensive. And then you make them do certain things, and you see how they react.
Right.
So that would probably is a sort of you usually do it in a laboratory. So the environment is quite controlled. You try to be as controlled as possible, but there are a lot of experiments done also in the field, so it doesn't have to be in a laboratory anymore.
Right. So is this similar or different from neuroeconomics?
Neuroeconomics is actually the study of how the brain reacts to certain kind of situations. And these situations are usually economic situations. This is why it's neuroeconomics. So you ask people to play these games that you would play in regular experiments, but rather than being simply in front of a computer, you scan their brain while they do it, so that you're able to see what part of the brain fires up when you're making certain kinds of decisions.
Okay. That's really fascinating to kind of do brain scans like that. How is Smith's economics different than modern economics? Excuse me.
Again, Smith works mostly with his observations and his readings. And so he writes in words, he works with words. Today, economics is much more mathematized than it was ever possible in Smith's time, just because the techniques were not available in Smith's time. So it's a very different, if you look at what Smith writes and what is published today in any economic journals, the two are almost foreign languages to each other.
Right. Sort of archaic language,
right.
I'm assuming. So I've never read The Wealth of Nations, but from what I understand, it's kind of an inquiry into nature and causes of the wealth of nations.
Yeah, that's exactly the title of the book, as a matter of fact.
Exactly. So what makes a country rich?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure that we do have a very good answer for that.
Right.
This is why I think Smith also inquires it and doesn't give you the answer.
This is the answer,
exactly.
Right.
The theory of moral sentiments, but it's this inquiry into the nature and causes of wealth. One way to think of it may be to think in terms of institutions. So if you have a set of institutions that allow you to flourish as an individual, then most likely you're able to grow enough as a country as well.
Right.
So in Smith's case, I think institutions that allows you as a worker to keep the fruit of your labor, as Smith would say. So a situation in which you're able to choose your job, you're able to earn your living without having any severe many severe restrictions, both on your choice, on your movement, and on your earnings, then that would allow you to develop enough and take advantage enough of the skills that are available and technology that are available, and to be more innovative, so that will bring more wealth.
So some would argue that knowledge would be the wealth of a country, and that they could measure it by that. Would you agree or disagree with this kind of sentiment?
Today, I think knowledge is absolutely a way in which a country grows richer.
Right.
Smith doesn't think much in terms of knowledge as much as we do. He does think in terms of knowledge, mostly in terms of innovation and our ability to make connections that allows us to bring new ways of production. But I think that today we think much more in terms of human capital, in terms of our knowledge, than our physical capital, in terms of what allows us to produce more.
So I know I asked you about behavioral economics already, but I read on your page, I believe, that the Scottish Enlightenment affects that. Can you explain or elaborate a little bit more on that?
So again, behavioral economics or experimental economics, so you can think of behavior as a subset of experimental economics, works through experiments, as it sounds. And I think that the Scottish Enlightenment, as I mentioned before, as a method that is similar to it. Right. But rather than using a physical lab like you have in behavioral and experimental, you use history. Right. But the idea is more or less the same, in the sense of you look at what is constant in human nature, and then you see when there is a change, and then you see the consequences of that change. So in that sense, history is our laboratory if you are in the 18th century.
So do you think that the Scottish Enlightenment period had a bigger overall effect on society, and what would you think that would be, or one?
So in a sense, I think that the Scottish Enlightenment had a very deep understanding of society at that time and social changes. It's an intellectual movement that emerged at the periphery of a big empire in a time of major economic boom. So you have a lot of innovation, a lot of growth at the economic level, but that also was present at the intellectual level, and so great boom in university, great boom in scholarship. And the question that there were among the many questions that a lot of people in the Scottish Enlightenment were looking at is what allows us to change, what allows us to be better off.
Right.
Are we better off?
Right.
And if we are better off, what allows us to be better off? Commerce was a major change at the time. So the introduction, the opening up of markets. Scotland was united with England in 1707, and with it went from being a relatively poor country to being a fairly rich country
right.
in less than a century. And that because of the opening up of the markets. So you have a very large increase in commerce, a very large increase in trade, which implied, again, a lot of innovation, both in terms of technical innovation, so steam engine, to banking, through a lot of engineering, botany, the study of botany exploded
right.
at that time. So you start asking, like, what does this change come from? Where does this change come from?
Mm-hmm.
And some of the Scots started to think commerce was a major factor in this change. So they're trying to understand what brings changes, in what are the causes of changes in society, and whether those changes are a good thing or a bad thing. Right? So there's also the evaluation of those changes.
It's interesting, and it's only one of those things that you can only see with time, right? Where it's only experimental at that point. So I just have one final question. Your lecture here at Boise State is entitled, "Why Read the Wealth of Nations Today?" Mm-hmm. So why should we?
Come to the lecture tonight.
That's all?
That's all.
All right. Well, unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. Thank you again to Professor Paganelli for coming onto the show. I'm your host, Sky McGeehee, and this has been Presents.